Okay, good morning and welcome. I'm Dr Niall Carson. I'm the Joint Patronage Lecturer in Modern Irish Literature here at the Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool. And I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to the 9th Liverpool Literary Festival, where we're again bringing internationally renowned writers to the city. So before I introduce this morning's speaker, I wanted to let you know that there will be time later for the audience to ask questions. But if you could wait for the microphone to come to you before we do that, that would be great. Thanks. And also, at the end of the session, your speaker will leave. We will leave just a little bit before you, so if you wouldn't mind waiting so that we have a chance to get to the table to get some copies of the book for signing. Okay, so today I'm delighted to be introducing Michael Magee and his novel Close to Home, which has been chosen as the winner of the John McGahern Prize for the debut book of Irish fiction in 2023. The prize is now in its 5th year and was established by the University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies to honour the memory of one of Ireland's greatest masters of prose fiction. And Magee's novel was picked by Colm Tóibín from a shortlist that included Noel O'Regan's Though the Bodies Fall and Colin Walsh's Cala. Tóibín in his selection comments said of the winner, Close to Home by Michael Magee has an astonishing narrative energy. The rhythms of the sentences and the lines of dialogue are powerfully managed. It is the story of a young man's struggle to live in a society that is haunted by violence and maimed by the present as much by the past. But is also a novel about love and friendship, with many scenes created with great tenderness and tact. Magee's work is marked by its clear-eyed characterization, observant humour, and a crushing sense of threat that rises and falls with kind of masterful execution within the text. I truly recommend it to you, and I'm delighted to have Michael here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, you've got one there.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. It's great to have you here. So it's been a remarkable year for you. You've won the Rooney Prize, the Nero Prize for Best Debut Fiction, the Waterstones Irish Book of the Year, and now, obviously, saving the best until last, the McGahern Prize. What has the year meant to you, and do you think it's changed you in any way?
Oh yeah, it's went straight to my head. Yeah, no, it's a mad sort of, because you can't, you don't know which way things are going to go, and you can only expect so much with these sort of things. And when you put a book out, yeah, you sort of you sit and wait and see what happens. And I've been very lucky in a sense that things have fallen the right way for me in all sorts of ways, And when it comes to things like this, it's all about timing and the right person reading at the right time and all that kind of thing, I think the thing that the real sort of change has been because the conditions have changed in terms of my writing and the work. Yeah. And that when I was writing this book, and it took me a long time to write this, there was an energy, and I was sort of desperate and hungry, and I really went far in myself, I sort of went to places that I otherwise wouldn't in order to write this, and I was sitting a few months ago, and I'm sort of trying to work on the second book, and it sort of dawned on me. It's fuck, I have to do this all over again. And am I prepared to go there? Am I prepared to take myself to these places? Because whether you like it or not, the conditions have completely changed. At the moment, I'm writing full time, and the first book has went pretty well as things go. So it is that kind of I'm trying to sort of recalibrate my brain in some way to actually be right, I gotta move forward with this,
Okay, it's great actually, because I wanted to talk to you a bit about that. You said about the way the book has been received and looking for readers, how the readership has to be ready for the book. But one of the words that this book has constantly been brought up in reviews of this work is necessary. Is that a meaningful phrase, and what does it mean to you, do you think? Why was this book necessary?
I'm not too sure now, to be honest.
Is it necessary?
I guess the thing is that the story is told from a very particular vantage point, a very particular perspective, It's young man from West Belfast, working class, as I am. This is my sort of cultural background. And I guess there isn't a lot of novels that have been written about Belfast who have been written from the perspective of the place that I'm from. Do you know?
Yeah.
Or at least none that have broken through in the way mine has, in terms of like British publishing and all that kind of thing, and on an international kind of level. And so in that way, like maybe that's what it's sort of referring to. And I think there is like there's a moment now. There's a distance, I think, from I think for a long time, Northern Irish fiction was associated with the Troubles, whether it was in a positive or negative way.
Yeah.
And I think British publishing got fatigued by that kind of writing and became less interested about the North. I think Britain in general got less interested about the North. And then in the last few years, I think there has been a bit of a shift. And I think, as I said, timing sort of comes into it in that way, you know. Yeah. People are more interested in what's happening across the water in a way that they probably weren't before. And I think my novel is probably the first that's emerged in that context of a sort of post-Troubles, post-conflict, ceasefire generation novel, which was, you know, completely, I didn't mean to do that. Like, that's just the position I was writing from, you know. And I think it allowed me in some way to interrogate that past and to be able to interrogate the effect that it had on my generation through the novel, you know.
Okay.
And so in some way, maybe that's what they're sort of referring to. But other than that, I haven't, you know. I don't know what people mean,
well, yeah,
you know.
That's fine. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable novel in many ways. There's so much to say. I mean, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's here today who said that, you know, he thought about ways in which former literary festival speaker Tabitha Lasley's book was a kind of a way of was similar in many ways, but it was in structure because it was a middle class book about a middle class protagonist who was trying to break into this working class community, and yours is kind of the other way around. And also, I was thinking about the ways in which your relationship to the city because of that. So Tabitha Lasley's from Liverpool, and she leaves to go. In many ways, Liverpool is a kind of it's the absent base that we don't know about Sean in the text. So your work is a Liverpool Irish work in kind of ways. In that way, then it sits as a working class work with people like James Hanley, Jim Phelan. You know, you have a much broader base, so it's not unprecedented. There are people like Emer McBride, Kevin Barry, who have relationships to the city. You know, can you tell us a little bit about your time in Liverpool, just for biographical information, what it means to you, you know, and how are we to see Sean in light of his experiences in Liverpool, particularly his education in the text, because it's kind of unknown quantity.
For sure. Yeah, it was a long time. It was a long time ago I was here, and let's just say I enjoyed it. I think, because the book is sort of post, you know, he sort of returned to Belfast after having studied in Liverpool, and it's about a year after he left Liverpool is whenever it's set. And similarly to Sean, like I studied here. I went to John Moores and studied English with creative writing. And I think the main thing I remember, because I wanted to get away from Belfast, like, you know, I sort of felt like I needed the escape. I was sort of looking around me and seeing where all my mates were going, you know. There was a lot of people getting into a lot of trouble, and I thought I need to get out of here before I get into this trouble, and it did. And I remember one of the big sort of things that afforded me was like space to be somebody else, you know, and to read publicly, and to sort of embrace this kind of, you know. And I was very like earnest about the whole thing, you know, and you know, being in an environment where other people are taking books seriously and speaking about them, and I think studying creative writing in particular sort of broadened my horizons in that way, because there was like some sort of looseness to it. You know, it was like you're engaging with texts on your own kind of terms, and you're looking at texts as a writer rather than as analysis, as like a theoretical analysis. Yeah. And they're two different modes of thinking, I think. So in the book you kind of get glimpses of Liverpool. Yeah. You sort of get these little moments where Sean's reflecting on, like, you know, walking around the city with his Moleskine journal, you know, and parking himself up in cafes and looking out the window, you know, and that kind of thing, and that was what I did. But I felt like, I mean, that was one of many things I did, but that was one of the. It was sort of felt like a liberation in some way, you know.
Yeah.
And so Liverpool was very, very important to me. It was kind of a formative experience, you know. To be able to go to this other city and be a version of yourself that had, and create a version of yourself that didn't exist before. And that's where Sean's at when he sort of returns, is that he comes back to Belfast and he's sort of fallen back in with his natural sort of cohort, like, you know, and it's the boys that he grew up with, and it's boys who are sort of predominant or profoundly sort of affected by their sort of material and circumstances in all sorts of ways, and that sort of falls back into modes of behaviour that he in some way was trying to escape from as well. And I think that's the tension of the book, is that he's being pulled between these different worlds, you know. But yeah, no, Liverpool's class.
Well, it is, yeah. And you lived off Smithdown, of course, so you know what I mean. You had this the full experience. So yeah, I mean, I have a couple of questions about some of the scenes in the text that's in the book itself. You know, one thing that struck me was thinking about, say, Sean's mother and her relationship to painting, you know, and to art. And I thought it was kind of a nice metaphor for the book itself, because it looks to me like her art is a way of dealing basically with trauma and coping, you know, as a form of self-expression in a society where expression is so constrained. Do you think that, you know, that in ways your own book is actually, it's a kind of a metatextual reference to this, or, you know, it's a metaphor for this, because that your own text actually is the same sort of thing. It's a sort of purge that you needed to get out to express the trauma of that period.
It kind of was a purge, yeah, to be fair. Like, and because the book was so sort of tied up with my own story. I mean, when I started up writing it, it was memoir. Like, at least that was kind of the direction it was going. And that was so much of the difficulty of writing it, was that it was sort of, I didn't know what it was, you know, and how far I was going to go in terms of fictionalizing or making stuff up. And so I guess I was sort of writing through that as much as anything. And I think so much of writing the book was also sort of confronting my own past, my own community's past, my family's past in different ways, you know, and sort of trying to get to the core of what it was that had brought me to that point in my life, you know. Because I was sort of, similarly to Sean, sort of lodged between two different worlds. I was being pulled in various directions in my own life. Between this kind of, because I wrote this book as part of a PhD in creative writing at Queen's. And so I'd moved into this academic environment that I was completely unused to, you know, and that was at odds with my sort of background.
Yeah.
And that created a great discomfort in me, you know. And because I sort of had moved away from the space that I'd grown up in, or sort of environment, I'd sort of abandoned it. And in abandoning it, it felt like I'd abandoned some region of myself in the process. It almost felt like a betrayal.
Right.
And so I felt this great shame in myself, you know, because I had isolated myself from my people.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so much of writing the book, I was trying in some way to understand that process. And it's the early incarnations of the book was much more about that, like, you know.
Right.
But as it progressed, it then, and as I sort of started looking at it as fiction, as something that was almost not my story, or at least like a version of my story that I had sort of distanced myself from in some way, it became much more about a very particular moment in Sean's trajectory, you know, which is this kind of in-between space, you know. And so much of like writing it was sort of writing through shame, you know, shame for who I was, shame from where I came from. Because I think the one of the great difficulties I had in writing altogether was like that I was reluctant to go to these places, that there was almost like a veil between me and the material I was trying to go into. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the Troubles, and a sort of general reluctance in going there. Because I thought, well, it's been written about, you know, and everyone's a bit bored of it, and I was bored of it, and I think that was a sort of coping mechanism. It was a way of like sort of pushing myself away from it. But it's sort of, as I was writing the book, it slowly dawned on me that it was kind of unavoidable.
Yeah.
That if I was writing about a generation of young people who were born when I was, sort of 1990, in and around that sort of early 90s period, that you could not write about it because it had affected us. Our parents had lived through this 30-year conflict. They had witnessed it, experienced it, and suffered losses.
Yeah.
And that had an effect on them. There's no two ways about it. And so that was sort of inherited, and there's this sort of, there's a lot of conversations happening now about intergenerational trauma and the inheritance of trauma and how that's affected a generation of young people from my generation. And so then it felt to me that I have to confront this.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And that was it was a difficult and complicated process in a lot of ways, and particularly when it came to sort of thinking about the mother character. Because my own mother was so much, like the mother character in the book is very directly based on my mother. And that was kind of important for me to sort of allow her to occupy that space in the book.
Yeah.
To sort of articulate her story,
Yeah, I mean, it's, that I suppose, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how that went down at home, but...
it was tricky, but for her, I think she knew, because I was talking to her a lot throughout writing the book, and she's always been very upfront about her past and wanting to talk about it. She's always felt the responsibility towards us, towards articulating the experiences that she had during that time. Like, my mother's from the Falls Road, and 30 years of her life was living through this, but she always felt like a responsibility towards telling us, because she didn't trust that we would learn about it elsewhere, whether through the political or educational system or whatever. She always felt that we had to know, so that we could understand ourselves better. So when I was writing the book, I was sort of keeping her abreast of what was happening.
Okay, yeah.
Then, but when she read it, I think it was overwhelming for her, because she saw herself.
Okay.
She saw herself very clearly, but at the same time, she was grateful for it. Yeah. That she felt like that her voice was allowed some space in literature, in a realm where her voice is usually excluded from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose that the love comes through so strongly in the text between a lot of the protagonists that it's, you can see that it's the relationships are so meaningful. That's one of the real strengths of the book. Another thing that occurred to me in the book is, reading the court scene, for example, I was reminded of Brendan Behan's Borstal Boy, and when he's at the Liverpool Assize, and he's wants to give this big speech, and then it's just such a different world. The book is very funny, and it's very funny in parts like that, where you're reading Sean's story and you just know what's going to happen, and it's the kind of juxtaposition of the naivety of Sean to some degrees with the kind of formal middle class language that's going on and the expectations and everyone in the courtroom. So, were you conscious that the book was going to have a lot of humor in it? Were you trying to write in that way, or is that something that came afterwards, or what? How does it work?
I'm just a very funny man.
Yeah.
It's sort of, naivety has a lot to do with it, actually.
Right.
I think that was one of the things that I had to understand about who Sean was. That he's 22. He thinks he's much smarter than he is to some extent.
Yeah.
But he is also profoundly naive about what those sort of structures that he's sort of coming up against in some way, or structures that are in some way he's sort of internalizing. The court scene was important in that way, because he's sort of getting kind of obnoxiously thinking he's going to talk his way out of it, and is suddenly confronted with the reality of the situation, which is that. But that sort of plays into his denial as well, and the denial of responsibility. That he is, he assaults this guy on the first page of the book. That's what the story's about, and him sort of coming to terms with that in himself and why he did what he did. And the court scene's the moment where the reality sort of just smacks him across the head, and he sort of realizes, I could have gone to jail here, and that's the scary sort of proposition. Humor sort of comes. I think it's tricky because it's an aspect of the book that probably isn't spoken about enough. Because immediately I'm like, troubles, sad mother, that kind of. But it is like so much part and parcel of like how I interact with people and in my life, and it felt natural for that to sort of filter through into the book. And also, like, what's funnier than, a couple of lads trying to work their way through a bender, and the obstacles they have to overcome in themselves. And just the sort of, I was weirdly talking about this at an event recently, and like how humor is a coping mechanism for all sorts of things.
It's very strong in the book,
And I guess that's kind of what it is.
Well, I know he's going down. It's a kind of an inevitability of it is quite horrible. So Sean's assault, I mean, okay, a subsequent community service up in Milltown Cemetery. It read to me something like Dante's Purgatorio, right? So they got all these lost souls. They're there for sins that they've committed. Sean's is wrath. We have the Republican dead there waiting for whatever vision of Ireland that's not quite coming. Were you aware of, did you have a lot of literary touchstones in mind when you're thinking about it? Were you aware of texts that kind of you wanted to bring in? I mean, I know Kundera comes up, for example, it's like, what were you thinking with that? Is there a framework for that?
At the risk of sounding like a dickhead, there was the thing. Milltown in and of itself is like a very symbolically rich space, as you sort of say, and actually the one of the sequences that I had in my head while writing those scenes, particularly because Sean spends a lot of time cutting grass, and he's going around the cemetery with a petrol strimmer and he's swishing it from side to side and taking the grass, and there's something about that that's kind of it kind of lulls him into a state of like semi-awareness. There's like kind of and there's a sequence in Anna Karenina.
All right.
Where Levin's cutting the grass. I don't know if you.
No, I don't know. No.
It's one of my favorite scenes in all of literature.
Right.
But it's Levin's the protagonist in Anna Karenina. That's sort of mostly based on Tolstoy himself. And he's sort of gone through a sort of an existential crisis essentially. And he goes and he owns this big country estate because of course he does. He's a big bureaucrat, an aristocrat. Sorry, and he sort of goes out into his land with the sort of peasantry and as a way of like bringing himself closer to the real life, And he's trying in some way to find some meaning in his life, and so he goes out and cuts the grass with a scythe with the peasants and is trying to keep up with them, And it's such a beautiful, and it's quite a long sort of scene, but it's just him moving through the grass, cutting the grass, having these interactions with the who are all sort of laughing at him, But that was the kind of, that's where it was sort of emulating it, right down to the sort of sentences and the way the sentences were built, the sort of slow building of detail, and trying to make it feel like Sean was in some way digesting all this sort of stuff in the back of his head, but without saying it, and just through action, just watching him move through the space. And I guess like there is this kind of, the whole sort of symbolic thing of, Bobby Sands been buried there and Joe McDonald, Kieran Nugent. And you've got a lot of commemoration stones, there's one for the whole county of Antrim for people who had lost their lives, volunteers and stuff, and also just the sort of imagery that sort of stands out to you when you're walking through Milltown, which is you'll have little tricolours on certain gravestones that will indicate that the person who's buried there is a volunteer. And we used to say Ogla, which is the Irish word for warrior, and these kind of things, sort of him being confronted by these images as he's moving through that space, working monotonously, and trying to understand why he's there, with these kind of head cases.
Yeah, well, exactly.
You're sort of surrounding him, and it just felt like a space that you could do a lot with, Yeah,
well, it works very powerfully. I mean, it's really, really strong scene in the book. Okay, yeah. I mean, we teach I teach this literary magazines module here at Liverpool, and I'm very interested in the idea of like, your pathway into writing. So you're the literary editor for the Tangerine.
Yes.
Has your experience of editing impacted upon your writing itself? I mean, do you think, reflecting upon other things, it seems a bit obvious, but as the experience of actually doing the work itself, has that changed the way you write?
I don't know. It probably has in some way. Tangerine's on a hiatus now, and quite an extended one, to be fair. COVID fucked us.
Right.
But we're sort of slowly trying to find our way back into it. We also ran out of money, which is never a good thing.
That's the fate of all literary magazines, I'm afraid.
You have a window of about 3 to 5 years, and then that's the... Yeah. But it was massive. It was hugely important for me doing that magazine, because we sort of realised that in Ireland there's a very rich magazine culture, obviously, but there was none in the north. Belfast didn't have its own literary magazine, and we sort of felt impelled to create one, and we did a lot of work with it. And I think it certainly had sort of exposed me to we were doing 3 issues a year. And each issue you were getting between 400 and 500 submissions of short stories alone. And I was the fiction editor, so that was my job. So you're reading about 1,000 odd stories. Or I'd say you're reading them, you're glancing to see what's good, But you're sort of confronted with this huge plethora of work that you otherwise wouldn't have been. And you sort of see trends and stuff in what people write. And also stylistic trends, which is interesting.
Okay, yeah.
A lot of young people writing like Sally Rooney, and then a lot of young men writing like Kevin Barry. These two, but I think it certainly did teach. Because so much a part of studying creative writing is I think acquiring an editorial eye and understanding the editorial process.
Okay, yeah.
In the workshop environment, because you're editing other people's work, and you're doing that as a way of understanding what's working in your own work. The difficulty is reapplying that editorial eye to your own work. That's the real hard bit.
Okay.
But that, I think, takes a lot of time and a lot of honesty with yourself. And I guess studying the magazine was just an extended version of that, or editing the magazine, that I was just doing the same thing that I would have been doing in a workshop, and it was just working with writers. Yeah. But that was the best part, was the part where you got a story that you really liked, and you knew there was a bit of work to do with it, and you knew that the writer that you were working with was open to that. And then the sort of dialogues that happened. And the work you end up doing through that was I think I certainly did learn a lot, for sure.
And did you bring through any writers that your work that you're particularly proud of, or?
We actually, fuck's sake, I don't want to do this, but we published Louise Kennedy's story in Silhouette. Yeah. We published that, and she got signed by an agent off the back of it through the Tangerine. Oh, brilliant! Who's now my agent too, Eleanor Burns' class. But she signed Louise off the back of that, and that's how she ended up getting her book deal.
Yeah.
So that's the one where that's particularly, and there's been other people who've got signed off the back of it, because the British agents were very interested in it, right. And were actually buying it. So it was and that was so much part of what the magazine was trying to do, was sort of open a door for writers, particularly from the north, but any young writer. Yeah. It was a worthwhile sort of thing,
Well, it actually brings me on to the next question, which is, because that obviously places you ideally to comment on the Northern Irish writing. This is the partitionist question, by the way, so you're free to answer this one. I was going to say but... So is there, what's the difference between Northern Irish and Southern Irish writing, and is there one? What's your view basically on contemporary Irish writing in that context, Jesus. Both sides of the border?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean,
do you think that Irish writing is going through a kind of a particularly strong phase at the moment, or do you think that actually that this is kind of about trendy books getting published?
I do think I think that Irish writing. I don't really. I try not to be partitionist in my thinking about how Irish writing, but sometimes you're forced into it. I think there has been. I think so much of the reason why Irish writing's in such a good sort of state of health. And it has been you have to think, in the last 40 years maybe, you think about even when Tabine was coming through, Anne Enright was coming through, you have these, we've always produced solid writers. But I think the magazine culture has a lot to do with it. I think The Stinging Fly in particular, for this current batch of young writers, I think you look at even Colin Baird, Kevin Barry, Sarah Baum, Nicole Flattery, Sally Rooney, John Patrick McHugh, the list goes on of writers who have come through that magazine, who were initially published there, there's just short stories in particular. Sally was the first thing she got published there was poems.
Right.
When she was like 19 or something,
Yeah.
and has like a very strong connection with the magazine and has for a long time. And so I think that like has been a catalyst in a lot of ways. I don't know if there's a huge difference. I mean, if I look to the writers who have influenced me, they're from the South, you know, John McGahern, Tabine, Anne Enright. Those writers were very important to me. Beckett, Joyce, all lemons, but and there has been some northern writers who have like sort of. I mean, Glenn Patterson, some of his early books in particular, were very good. Michael McLaverty, Bernard McLaverty, them boys. But like, it's very. I don't know. I think in the north at the minute we are still contending a lot with the conflict, like you know. It'll be interesting to see because Wendy Erskine has a novel coming out. And it's set in a contemporary thing, and it's about, I think it's loosely based on the rugby rape case trial in the north that happened, which was a terrible sort of, miscarriage of justice, I think, in all sorts of ways. And I think she's sort of interrogating that. And I think in the north, there is like weird, but I generally don't know what the difference. We're all Irish writers in my mind, like, you know, and I'd be very reticent to call myself a Northern Irish writer. In fact, anyone that calls me it is straight into the bad books, mate. But I think that's something I have to contend with as a writer at the moment. It's something, because anytime I'm at a festival, like, or, you know, a book festival, I'm lumped in with Belfast writers. And I'm like, I have nothing in common with these people. You know, because they're from different next. Like, I have much more in common with someone like Kevin Barry or Colin Bart, because we're from a particular class. We're writing about particular worlds, like, and we're interrogating the same sort of things about manhood, about masculinity, and class. And so, I don't understand why, you know. And it's like, well, it is like basically a partitionist mode of just being like, well, lump the Belfast ones together, everything will be sweet. Do you know? Regardless of like the fact that we don't have anything thematically in common. Or stylistically, really.
Well, I mean, I suppose it's a remarkable. I mean, the island itself produces such incredible writers at such a pace, and I think the magazine culture is absolutely central to that. I mean,
and the resources like the Arts Council as well. I mean, there's so much money. People are getting in the south. I mean, people are living as full-time writers essentially, like who have only like one book or like, you know, because of the resources that are available to them, which is important.
That's great, So, okay, to talk a little bit about then, I'm conscious of our time, but just before you give a reading, could you talk? I mean, characterization is incredible in the book. It's really, really strong. One of the things that I was thinking about was Anthony. Like, even though his capacity for violence is immense, he's also really vulnerable. You know, and he's quite sinister. He reminds me of Begbie or someone like that. You know, if you've been drinking with someone, you're thinking, oh God, like, how am I going to get the right answer here in case I'm going to be killed? You know, so you have that kind of real terrible tension that he just generates, and you know it. You know, it's just screams off the page. To talk a little bit about, I suppose, Anthony as a character, just it is what you mentioned earlier about the Good Friday Agreement, the peace dividend. You know, those that are left behind. Who, you know, did you have fun writing them, or was it, you know?
Oh, I mean, it's always fun writing characters that challenge you in that way, you know, and I think there was, because I know many Anthonys, you know, and I know a lot of, I know a few of them, like, and I think there is always this, and I think like so much of, part of the sort of process of writing a book was trying to understand why, you know, people are the way they are, and what kind of sort of, how their lives have been structured in particular ways, and how trauma has affected people, and how they find mechanisms for coping. And for Anthony is like such a complicated and difficult character that, but I knew that like so much of who he is, there is like this goodness somewhere in there, do you know? And so much of that tension in him is because of circumstances that aren't his fault. Do you know? And like his story is that he was abused as a child, you know, and he is at a point in his life where he has a son who was the age he was when this terrible thing happened to him, and it triggers a kind of breakdown. And the book is him sort of destroying everything around him in that kind of incredibly self-destructive mode, and Sean being quite powerless to do anything about it. And yet, through that, you know, he sort of feels a responsibility towards Sean and trying to protect him. But that impulse to protect is almost oppressive for Sean. Because, I mean, even anytime he's around him, it's like he holds him to him. He's like got him in his head and he's kissed him in the face. And it's like this very physical, emotionally charged relationship. And it comes out, I think, of his space of guilt because, you know, it's Sean's father who has abused his brother. And that really complicates his feelings towards him, that he feels that guilt himself. Because he sees the effect that this has had on his older brother, his role model, his only male role model that he has in his life, you know. And that's something, because now Sean's at a stage in his life where he's becoming a man and he has to become his own person. And he's looking to his brother and he's seeing the state that he's in. And for him, it's very difficult to sort of come to terms with it, to see his vulnerability, you know.
Oh, it's incredibly done, you know. It's because, you know, your sympathy is with him. You know, that is just you're fully drawn into the character. He's, you know, it's great. I think we're probably asking you now to perhaps you'd read a section from the book if that's all right. And
I'll just read for like, I don't know. I mean, I my instinct is to read for less time, at the risk of losing people. But I'll read like the first few pages, and then we'll see how we are. I can jump. There's a section I'll maybe read from Milltown.
Okay, it'd be great.
I think. This is a weird chair. Hang on. Okay. There was nothing to it. I swung and hit him, and he dropped. A girl came flying forward and pushed me. What'd you do that for? The lad was lying there, and I was standing over him, and there were people all around me making noise. By the time I got away from the tussle, 2 Land Rovers pulled up. A jaded-looking peeler with a receding hairline came towards me. Is that blood? He said, pointing to a stain in my shirt that could have been anything. He took my name and number and told me he would be in touch. I held my hands up and said that was no problem. The lad came at me, I said. I didn't know what to do. At the top of the street, the lad was put in a stretcher, and the stretcher was heaved into the back of an ambulance. I think it's best you make your way home, the peeler said. I decided he was a good peeler, a helpful peeler. We'll be in touch, he said, and I thanked him. Thanks very much, I said. Back at the flat, Ryan had his phone in his face and was pacing up and down the living room, looking for a party. But it was 5 o'clock in the morning and the birds were out. He pulled the blinds closed as if that would help and nearly took the window with him, the brightness. I grabbed the purple throw Mama had given us as a moving in present and pulled it over my head. I lay with my head on the pillow and stared through the space between the empty bottles. Ryan checked the fridge, the cupboard next to the fridge. He lifted a can from the counter and gave it a shake. I give up, I said. Give up? I'm done, fuck all. I'm going to bed. Fuck's sake, Sean, don't be leaving me hanging here. Don't leave me anywhere, I'm in the next room. Bounce into my bed, sure. We'll watch a film. We need to stop doing this. Doing what? Come on. The window above the bed was open, and the breeze wafted through. I stripped down to my boxers and climbed under the covers that stayed on the outside so I could creep into my own bed as soon as Ryan passed out. The wall was black with mould, and it made the room smell damp. There were clothes all over the place. Takeaway cartons, cups and glasses and empty cans. Ryan smoked too much weed. That's what it was. It made him lazy. It made him not give up bollocks. I said to him, you smoke too much of that shit, and took the spliff off him. He didn't care. He was sinking into it nicely. And he had his favourite film on, The Shawshank Redemption. He made me watch it every time we ended up like this. It gave him hope. Watch this, he said. It was that scene he loved, the one where Andy Dufresne arrives at the penitentiary and all the inmates are going mad, screaming at him, calling him and the rest of the newcomers fresh fish. I didn't think much of Andy the first time I laid eyes on him. That was Ryan's favourite line. He thought it was brilliant. I did too. Never judge a book by its cover. That's what that means. Never judge anybody, because you never know. And I'm going to jump forward to about halfway through the book. And Sean has been to court and been hit with 200 hours of community service and a £600 fine. It's actually important as well. And this is maybe his second shift at community service. And there's a guy here called Joe, who's a supervisor, who's mentioned, and then another guy called Fra, who comes into the scene, who he's met just before this, and he's seen sort of like a malignant presence following him around the cemetery. Okay, I think that's it. I don't like doing things I've never done before in front of other people in case I do it wrong and make a dick out of myself. So I watched this Joe show me how to lift the choke and pull the starter cord, then how to change the wire and hook a strimmer to the harness, which lightened the weight, making it easier to lean with my elbow on the handlebars as we trooped through the cemetery. Me and 5 men I didn't know. People came in on different days, and the fellow who spoke to me on my first shift. He walked alongside me with a fag sticking out of his mouth, puffing great clouds of smoke without a care in the world about the petrol tank he had tucked under his arm and how easily the fumes could catch. "What did you do, kid?" he said to me. "What?" "To get here, what'd you do?" "Told you last time. I got done for assault." "Aye, but why?" I dropped my head and quickened my pace. But no matter how fast I walked, he was right there, dragging his boots behind me. Joe had a leaf blower strapped to his back and was stalking between the headstones like some kind of ghostbuster. He led us to a patch down the back where there weren't many graves, but the waterlogged grassland was drawn swarms of midges that bit every inch of exposed skin. I didn't want to fall behind the other men, and I didn't want to look like I didn't know what I was doing. But my eagerness to keep up made me cut too close to the ground, taking chunks out of the muck, splattering my chest and arms, my face shield even, making it difficult to see past the mud seeping through the already mucky mesh. Before long, I was twice as dirty as the other men and hadn't cut half the grass. My arms were sore, the bottom of my back. The harder I tried, the more awkward the strimmer became, juddering as it did under my arm, the shaft wobbling with the momentum of the spool, butchering the field. The first smoke break couldn't come quick enough. I slumped under the curb of the nearest grave and lay back to look at the sky. It was so clear and blue and lovely to look at that I held my phone up in front of me. But instead of taking a photograph, I flipped the camera around and took a selfie. My face was back with muck, and my hair was damp with sweat, and in the background of the picture, dandelions leaned with their big heads to the side. I sent it to Mairead, thinking it would give her a laugh. One of the men closest to me saw what I was doing and said, "Jesus Christ, he's worse than my wee girl." "Who is?" "He is, taking pictures of himself." "How old's your wee girl?" The men laughed. "No call for that now, Fra," they said. "Sure, he can take it. He's a big boy. Aren't you, Samuel?" The man called Samuel nodded, but his eyes were locked on the ground. When the smoke break was over, Jim led us back towards the middle of the cemetery, to a field where the grass was lush and green and far easier to cut. I was starting to get the hang of it, swinging the strimmer more from the hips now, rotating from side to side. It was hypnotic. The sound of the strimmer wire slicing through the grass spraying up into the air. I didn't have to think about what I was doing. I didn't have to think about anything. The engine drowned everything out, and my hands, tingling with the tremors, started to feel like they didn't belong to me, that they were being carried by the motion of the strimmer itself, and, as if by magic, the work was getting done. It took us half the shift, right up until after the lunch break, to finish the field. And when we did, Joe treated us to another 10-minute smoke break. We plunked ourselves on the grass and swigged from bottles of lukewarm water, handed out by one of the younger lads who'd been sent across the road. Your man, who kept asking me about what I had done, whose name was Fra, was sitting close by. He leaned with his hands on the grass behind him and surveyed the field. "Do you know why there's no headstones in this field?" he said. I didn't answer. I knew he wanted to tell me. This here isn't just a field kit. This is the poor ground. You know what the poor ground is? I did, but I humoured him. 80,000 people are buried under your feet right now, he said. 80,000. And that's just on this patch. There's 3 patches. See that field over there? And that one there? You're talking over 200,000 people. And not one of them has a name. They lost their names because they couldn't afford to buy their own plots. And the sick people got chucked on top of them. The ones who keeled over with typhus and influenza. Now they talk about the disappeared. They want to know where all those people are when they've been disappearing people themselves for years and years. And they're right here. They're under his grass. Now you tell me who's in the wrong. I knew exactly who was in the wrong, but I was afraid to say in case Fred didn't want to hear it. I just sort of agreed with him, hoping he'd leave me alone. He didn't. You know who else is buried here? He said. There are so many people buried in that cemetery. I hazarded a guess with Giuseppe Conlon, thinking that would be someone he'd want to talk about. But no. Have you ever seen Darby O'Gill? He said. I hadn't. I wasn't even sure what Darby O'Gill was. The main character's buried here, Fra said. In the poor ground? No, for fuck's sake, here, in the cemetery. I didn't know if I was supposed to be impressed or what. I just nodded along. It was that kind of conversation. And Fra kept talking about the film and the main character in the film, who was played by a man called Albert Sharp. He was from the Falls. He grew up on Avey Parade. And that seemed to mean something to Fra. Maybe he was from that neck of the woods himself. I tried to ask him if that was the case, but Fra was in full flow, telling me a story about how a man showed up at Albert Sharp's door one day, looking for him. This was back in the 50s. Nobody had much of anything back then. Working in the mills was hell on earth, and there was no steady work at the docks, not if you were a Catholic. Fra made sure to emphasise this, as he described the man standing at Albert Sharp's door that day, all dressed up in a suit and a hat and shoes that were so shiny that the kids in the street stopped playing their games and crowded round to watch. It was Albert Sharp's wife who answered the door. She was in her apron, and she saw this well-dressed man standing in her doorway and thought she was being evicted. The man sensed her panic and told her he wasn't looking any trouble. He wanted to speak to her husband, Albert, and she paused. His accent threw her. Who are you? She said. And do you know what the man said? Fra paused for effect. Walt Disney. That's mad, I said, isn't it? Walt Disney showing up at his door in the Falls. Did his wife not invite him in? Of course she fucking. Why are you busting my balls? The other men had overheard and were laughing. Are the little people buried here as well, Fra? They said. I laughed along with them. It seemed like the thing to do. And then Fra looked at me and I went quiet. He had that effect on people, and it seeped out to the men sitting around us. Suddenly everybody was looking at their phones, smoking their fags, staring off into the distance. It was eerily quiet, and Fra had this grin on his face like he knew he had me, and all he had to do was lean over my shoulder and whisper, "Who's your dad?" he said. I'll leave it there.
Oh, thank you very much. That's great. I think we've time now just to hand it over to the floor for a few questions. Have we any questions? Yep. This gentleman here with the glasses.
Thank you. Hi, Michael. I read the book. I loved the book. So thank you.
Thank you.
But on the book cover, there was a quote that said, "This is a love letter to Belfast." And I just thought that's like saying Trainspotting is a love letter to Edinburgh. Is it a love letter to Belfast, Michael?
It actually says it's a love letter to Northern Ireland, which is a fucking nightmare. It's on the paperback, and it was entirely and totally my fault that this blurb got through. My editor sent me the proof, the sort of mock-up of what the paperback cover was going to look like, and I didn't even look at it. I was like, "Aye, brilliant, well done." And then the paperback came out, and my good friend Stephen O'Neill, who's an academic at Queen at Trinity. Anybody who knows him will know that he is the most anti-partitionist person you'll ever meet in your life. In fact, this whole academic career is built around partition. He was immediately like, "What the fuck's this?" And I was like, "Oh no!" And then and it says a love, and it is certainly not a love letter to Northern Ireland. if anything, it's quite the opposite. And so I emailed my editor and was like, get that off, So I don't know what print run is actually being taken off on. But no, you're completely right. I don't know if it is. I mean, to be fair though, there is like some redeeming qualities about the characters in particular, and I think that's really important. But as a state in and of itself, if anything, the novel's in contention with it, and is in some way trying to interrogate it and what sort of effect the state apparatus in and of itself has on these characters, particularly as a sort of post-Good Friday Agreement generation of young people who have sort of not who haven't reaped the spoils of peace, essentially. The sort of disaffected youth who've been abandoned in that regard, So yeah, that was a slip for sure. And the guy that wrote that review as well, I don't like him too much. He's and he didn't really like my book either. I don't think. And I
don't think he's read it.
No, I mean that's the thing, and I think he's a very good reader. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yep, this lady here.
I haven't read the book yet, so I will have to apologise if the question's not appropriate. But just with you mentioning trauma, I'm wondering whether there are any sort of factual or scientific resources. I'm thinking about, it made me instantly think of, I think the author's Bessel van der Kolk. It's The Body Keeps the Score. It's all about generational trauma. I'm wondering whether any works like that influenced your writing.
There was the big thing was because it was a lot of sociological studies. One of them in particular was done with University of Ulster in tandem with, I think, the University of Tel Aviv, that was about inherited trauma and the statistics around that. And I think one of the statistics that was batting around was that something like half of the population of the north of Ireland suffers from some form of PTSD, which is one of the highest rates in the world. It's an insane level of people. There was other sort of research that was done. One of the big sort of statistics that really would, because the troubles happened in particular localities. I mean, it happened across the north for sure, and everybody was indirectly affected in some way. But out of 92 postcodes that constitute the state of the north, 14 of them saw a disproportionate amount of violence, and they're working class areas, the poorest areas in the north. So West Belfast, Craigan, North Belfast, places in Strabane, places like that, across McGlen, and if one of the most sort of telling sort of things about this sort of inherited trauma is that since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, more young people have lost their lives to suicide than died during the whole course of the conflict. So in less time, more people have lost their lives, and you can map that by area. The disproportionate amount of people who lost their lives to suicide come from those areas, those exact same areas. And there's no coincidence also that there's a sort of a drugs epidemic essentially in the north. And a lot of young people are taking drugs in order to sort of medicate, And then that is also inherited because a lot of, one of the modes of trying to, my mother was on some form of anxiety medication since she was a teenager, because she was already sort of in that place, and that was symptomatic. A lot of women, young women in particular, were medicated from a very early age during the Troubles to sort of help alleviate that. And that's sort of manifested in sort of really difficult ways, and ways that they're very tricky to overcome. There's also a massive lack of mental health resources and access to sort of mental health facilities and stuff. In fact, it's collapsing, the medical system and all sorts. If you think the NHS is bad in England, Jesus Christ, go to the 6 counties. It is wild, So there is these sort of structural problems and systemic problems that are sort of feeding into it as well. But the inherited trauma thing is really interesting because for the first time, it sort of feels like it's part of the conversation that's happening now in a way that it isn't. There's young people who are talking, they're speaking in them terms, and are actually making art about it as well. Kneecap in particular, you think about what their film's doing, and how they're so much part of what they're doing there is talking about trauma, and how it's biological, in your thing. And I think Body Keeps the Score has a lot to do with that. But they were certainly really important in coming to understand it,
Thanks. Have we any other questions? There's a gentleman up there at the back with his hand up. Yeah. I can't see. Is that a green shirt you're wearing? Yeah. Great.
Hi, you're right. I've heard you speak in the past about sort of working class background and shyness in your work. I was wondering how you got over that over the years.
Yeah.
How you overcome that shyness.
Oh Jesus, mate! You just have to put yourself in these positions, like, don't you? I mean, it's. I think it was a big. See, when I went to university in Liverpool, right? When I went to John Moores, everybody was working class. Everybody around me was like, most people were from like Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle, Wrexham, sort of, you know, northern towns and North Wales. And so I felt completely at home. Even in class, like, there was like enough sort of work. It never felt like, it was only when I returned to Belfast and went to Queen's where I was like, fuck me, middle class people. It's like, and I felt completely at odds with myself and like a fish out of water, you know. And it was really difficult for me to move in that environment. And to understand who these people were, you know, and try and get on with them and try and figure out how to navigate that space. And it took me a long time, actually. Like, I remember, because I could never speak, you know, and I never felt confident enough to be able to speak, to articulate myself or express myself in any way. And so I was always the one that sat back and tried to listen and try and imitate how other people spoke. And it was a real concerted effort, actually. Like, I remember like sitting down and trying to acquire the language, you know. And I think by the time I got to do the PhD, which was like 2016, so there was a gap of about 5 years between my MA and PhD, 4 years. The MA felt much more like uncomfortable. But by the time I got to the PhD, I had built some degree of confidence. I'd been writing for a while. I'd published a couple of short stories. And I'd moved or assimilated into that world a bit more. You know, I was sort of surrounded by those people. And that's sort of, and I grew in confidence. But even at that, and then being in that environment at the PhD where you have to defend your thesis, you have to like sit in a room and, pardon, I keep burping. You have to sort of, you're forced to. And it took practice and it took like work and reading. And I read a lot of sort of theoretical texts to try and broaden my language in some way, or try and acquire that language. And it wasn't easy. I think that's part of the reason why working class people have such a high dropout rate, particularly in more prestigious universities, you know. Like the Queen's dropout rate for working class people is incredibly high. Right. In fact, most people I know who have went to Queen's from where I'm from have dropped out. They just can't hack it because the environment doesn't align with the environment they were born into or the people they are, and that's an institutional thing. But yeah, no, it was just I had to practice a lot, you know, and just put myself in awkward positions and difficult positions. And now it's easy, you know. So yeah.
Well, that's great. Listen, I think that's all we've time for. Sorry about that. So perhaps we'll go out and sign a few books, and you can
for sure.
You can ask some questions out when we get outside. Say thank you very much for Michael Magee.
Thank you so much. Thank you.